Hello, this is a podcast looking at what basic paganism is. It was suggested after a conversation via Facebook with a friend who said she was having difficulty finding resources to offer to someone she knew who is a non-pagan who would like a bit of an introduction to what is paganism in order to have a wider understanding of the subject. There's obviously a load of books out there, but not everyone necessarily wants to sit and plough through a lot of books. Maybe something sort of visual, audio would be preferable for some people at any rate. Now you have to bear with me. I'm multitasking. I'm trying to make a rhubarb crumble as I talk to you, just to prove that men can actually multitask sometimes. So do bear with me. Paganism is a term that covers a very broad array of ideas and concepts. It's a very wide religious category, which itself is something of a problem. It comes from the Latin root word paganus, which changed its meaning over a period of years, both within ancient Rome itself but also since then. It started off deriving from the word pagus, which means place, locality, and when it's used in a religious context, or was back then, it sort of suggested someone who followed the gods of the place, their local deities, gods of the local rivers, the forests, the fields, the mountains, etc. So if you want to put it in sort of League of Gentlemen terms, it was local religion for local people. However, even in ancient Rome, the word pagus had slightly rude connotations. It sort of meant a yokel, someone who was a bit of a country bumpkin, I suppose we would say in modern English. So it was used in a slightly snotty sort of a way by people who lived in the cities to refer to the people who lived in the countries. Then eventually it moved on and started being used by soldiers, the Roman soldiery, as a way of referring to civilians, and again in a ever so slightly snotty context. So it's never been what you would call a flattering term. Well, not until very recently anyway. Once Christianity began to get under sway, there was a lot of talk of the armies of God, serving in God's army, and devout Christians, be they laity or priests or monks or what have you, being called to serve in God's army. So they started using the term paganus in a similar sort of way to the way that the Roman soldiery had used it. So rather than referring to civilians, it now referred to the unconverted, those who were not in God's army, which does include quite a broad array of people. And it certainly did at that point in history. Then from there it went to kind of broadening in its context to refer to a whole group of religions. Now, if we're thinking theology, most religions have a central theology, and a lot of religions, at least the ones we're used to in the West, have an agreed upon theology that most, if not all, of the devotees subscribe to. So we're quite used to the idea of Christianity and Judaism and Islam believing in the existence of one single God. And often, well, maybe not quite so much these days, but certainly in the past, decrying the existence of anybody else's God, to say ours is the real one and anybody else's God is a false one. Paganism doesn't have a single theology, and that is something of a challenge, it has to be said, both for people who are just trying to learn about the subject in a general way, but also for academics and theologians and historians and so on writing about the subject. But it's not without precedent as a practice. If we look across the waters to Hinduism, in India and of course many other countries as well, Hinduism has no singular theology. You will find some Hindus who are basically monotheists, who regard all of the many gods and goddesses like Lakshmi and Shiva and Vishnu and so on as different names for the same central force, the same eternal overarching being who is just known by hundreds of different names and depicted in hundreds of different images and so on. You'll find other Hindus, particularly within the Smartist traditions, who take the approach that each of these deities, these gods and these goddesses, are real beings with their own independent existence, their own likes, their own dislikes, their own preferences, their own goals, their own aims. They all participate in the universe. They're all within the realm of karma and dharma, but they are very, very real beings. They're not just different names for the same thing. The polytheist approach. You'll find other Hindus who regard the gods as more like poetic metaphor, ways of describing nature and human psychological states and so on. And they come at it more from a sort of an atheist angle, in which they see tradition and celebration and festivity and so forth as very important, and they share the values, the ideals that are expressed in Hinduism, but they don't fully see the gods as real. They see them in more sort of, I suppose these days we would say, psychological abstract terms, the kind of things that Carl Jung would be comfortable talking about. And you get other variations of belief within Hinduism as well, as the ones I've just mentioned. That has made things somewhat difficult, perhaps, for writers wanting to write about religion and beliefs to know quite how to describe Hinduism, in the same way that they struggle to know how to describe Western paganism. There is a Hindu scholar, a chap called Balangangadhara, not a hugely famous, prominent Hindu scholar, but he writes a fair number of books and so on. And one thing he has argued is that Hinduism as a broad concept is difficult. His proposition is that during the age of empires, particularly European empires, when people from Britain and Portugal and France and Spain and so on were going over to India to try and claim territory and build trading empires and so forth, what they encountered were 1,001 localized religious cults, with some similarities but also with significant differences between them. And Europeans found it very confusing. They were just sort of overwhelmed by the variety. And so what he suggests happens is that they just started referring, sort of lumping them all into a pot and referring to all of these many different religious practices as if they were basically one and the same thing, and just said, oh, you lot over there, you're all Hindus. He further goes on to argue that Westerners have spent so long doing this that Indian people themselves have come to accept the reality of Hindu as a demographic label. So when they're filling in forms and boxes and it says, tick the box for your religion, they'll happily tick the Hindu box. He says it would be more sort of accurate to reflect the true diversity of Indian religion rather than reducing it to a tick box exercise that essentially started as a way of appeasing the Western powers. So he sees Hinduism, the idea of Hinduism as a big label, as something that's come about as largely a result of imperialism and colonialism. In fairness, if we're going to be historical, the Muslim empires that were dominating India had been referring to Hinduism in that kind of a way long before the British Raj and the rest of it started up. So this is not a purely European phenomenon. This is something that's gone on for a longer period of time, but you could still see it as a result of empire. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in Indian politics because it's a huge subject in itself. But we could suggest that something like that process happened in the West. That when Christian monks and priests and bishops and other writers were looking at the various cults and religions of the ancient world, the ones that they were emerging out of, they looked at the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians and the Germanic tribes and the Celtic tribes and so on. They saw 1,001 very different, very confusing cults, some of which said similar things to each other and some of which said quite different things from one another. And just like imperial powers might have just lumped all of the Indian religions together and said, oh, you lot, you're Hindus. So maybe those early Christian writers looked at all of these ancient cults and said, oh, you lot, you're just all pagans. And it became this catch-all way of describing not one religion, but a whole vast array of religions with some similarities and some significant differences. And we've continued thinking about the religions of the ancient world in that sort of way ever since. And even those of us who class ourselves as pagan are perhaps sharing the language of that kind of religious imperialism, in a sense, of just saying you lot. Except we're kind of saying us lot, if you see what I mean. So that's arguably one of the reasons why, just as within Hinduism, so within Western paganism, you've got some pagans who are monotheists, some pagans who are pantheists, some who are polytheists, some who are atheists, and you've got all sorts of other variations. So, to give you an example, if we're thinking about the Greek gods, which many people are fairly familiar with, Zeus, Hera, Aphrodite, Apollo, and so forth, there are some pagans, in the modern time I'm talking about, not just the ancient ones, but in the 21st century, there are some pagans who regard all of those beings as very real spiritual presences. Each has their own likes, dislikes, preferences, their own holy days, their own outlook on life and the cosmos. Each has things they want to encourage their human and potentially non-human devotees to engage in. So these beings, these gods, are just as real as you or I. And just as we are all part of the human race, you could say they're all part of the divine race. But that doesn't make two humans interchangeable and identical, and they would argue it doesn't make two deities interchangeable and identical either. Polytheism. You get other pagans who say that all of these different gods and goddesses are just different names for what is essentially the same thing, the same profound cosmic forces. There are some pagans who say these cosmic forces are all one singular entity, in a sense. It's sometimes referred to as inclusive monotheism, the idea that every single god and goddess is just a different name for the same central, vast force which goes beyond gender. It's neither male nor female. It defies label. It's just so vast and incomprehensible. Other pagans, particularly you find a lot of people who are interested in Wicca or are committed Wiccans, quite often talk about that similar idea but gendered. So they'll say that all goddesses are different names for one goddess, all gods are different names for one god. So it's almost the same idea, except rather than one being that is beyond gender, there are two beings, one male and one female, which manifest in a million and one different guises and names, but are all ultimately different ways of understanding the same being, or beings, the same cosmic forces. That's a very commonly held belief in this day and age, and there is some evidence that some people in the ancient world also thought in a similar sort of a way. There are other modern day pagans who, a bit like a lot of the Hindus we were just talking about, regard the various gods and goddesses as more like poetry. Symbols, metaphors for the sea, the storms, the sun, the moon, life, death, love, justice, etc., etc. And they see it in more sort of psychological terms, that ceremony and ritual involving these gods is a way of communing with nature, including human nature, including what's inside us as well as the world outside us. Who are fundamentally atheist pagans, because they don't see those deities as real, just as useful shorthand for describing the great cosmic experience of life itself. All of those pagans and other variations of belief exist side by side with each other these days, and did so in the ancient world as well. Paganism does tend towards pluralism, as does Hinduism, in that whereas in some religions you have a notion of exclusive truth. Our religion is right, everyone else has got it wrong. There is only one way, one truth, and this is it. Pluralist religions, like Hinduism, like paganism, take the approach that, to quote from Vedic sources, there are many roads to the top of the mountain. Each religion has some element of truth in it, and possibly has bits wrong in it as well. So what I believe has truth in it, what a Jewish person or a Muslim person or a Buddhist believes also has truth in it. Therefore, rather than me running around trying to convert other people, I just say, well, I believe this, you believe that, that's fine and dandy, let's get on with it. So there is no notion of one person being absolutely correct and absolutely true. So you don't get different types of pagan running around trying to convert one another, because there's no investment in that approach. Sorry, just letting the dog out. What that leads to is a greater degree of peacefulness between different religions, which does not mean for 1 second that in the ancient world everyone was sitting around hugging each other and singing Kumbaya. Pagans went to war a hell of a lot, but it was war for land, it was war for wealth, it was war to enslave other nations, war for lots of ugly, greedy motivations, rather than war for religious ideology. So the notion of going to war to convert another nation was quite strange to the people of the ancient world. Just wouldn't have made any sense to them. And you don't get modern day pagans of one tradition running around trying to convert pagans of another. You do get snobbery though, but that's a separate issue. Having said about traditions, there are a number of traditions in modern paganism. So just as you get different denominations of Christian, you get Baptists and Methodists and Catholics and Christadelphians and so on, so you get different types of modern day pagan. Coming back to those ideas of Balangangadhara, we could say maybe, are these different types of the same thing, or are they quite separate religions that have all just been lumped together in the distant past, and someone said, oh, you lot, you're all pagans? That's a moot point, and in some senses it doesn't really matter one way or the other at this point in time at any rate. So you get Wiccans, you get Druids, you get Heathens, Chemetics, Hellenics, the Nova Roma, and all sorts of other variations like the Remover and so on. I'm not going to attempt to cover them all in this podcast. Perhaps in future podcasts we'll go into it a little bit, but it would be much nicer to get people who are heathen talking about heathenry, people who are removers talking about remover and so on, rather than me talking on behalf of other people. It'll be much more dynamic and engaging to get the straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. My own personal tradition is Druidry, which I will talk a little bit about, but what I want to say at this stage is that some traditions are very much rooted in one particular culture. So you get traditions of paganism that are very rooted in Celtic culture, the ancient Irish and Welsh and British, so forth, deities. You get others that are very rooted in ancient Greece or ancient Rome or ancient Egypt. The ancient Lithuanian tribes, all sorts of parts of the world have their ancient traditions. And of course, if we look to Hinduism in India, to Taoism in China, to Shinto in Japan, to the many different African traditional religions, you could argue that these are all variations on a theme to some extent, in that a lot of the same ideas crop up, but using the culture and the language and the traditions from different parts of the world. That said, there are also some pagan traditions, Wicca is one of the very prominent ones, that are not tied to one specific culture. So you can get Wiccans, for example, who during the course of a ritual might speak about and praise and pray to, or well, commune with Greek deities and Celtic deities and Anglo-Saxon deities, rather than being exclusive to one particular culture. So not all pagans are centred in one culture, some are embracing of a much sort of wider perspective and diversity. The choice of culture is exactly that, it is a choice. So it's not the case that to follow Greek deities you have to be Greek by birth, to follow Egyptian deities you have to be Egyptian by birth, or anything quite like that. Sadly, there is a degree of nationalist fervour present in some branches of paganism. Those of us who are a bit more woolly liberals, or whatever you want to describe us as, would argue that this is a very modern phenomenon. If you look to the ancient world, people married into tribes, they moved about, they traded, they didn't have these hang-ups that, oh, you're the wrong colour, you're the wrong this, you're the wrong that, you can't worship our gods or any of this nonsense. That's quite a modern day hang-up that's come about in the last few centuries. But there are people in 21st century paganism who do get very, very shirty and say our religion is for people of our nation, we don't want any foreign types, as it were, getting involved. So that does happen. Wish it didn't, but it does. Having said that, there are broad theologies, polytheist, monotheist, pantheist, etc., traditions within both ancient and modern paganism. There are also some things that crop up so commonly that you could describe them as pretty much universal. I say pretty much because there's bound to be someone somewhere in the world who would describe themselves as a pagan who would say that they don't follow what I'm about to tell you about. What I'm about to tell you about is animism. Now, animism is an ancient belief system. A lot of historians argue that if we were able to jump in the TARDIS and go back to Stone Age times, then it would probably be the earliest form of religious expression of any type or variety. There are different permutations on animism, so it's not as if every single animist in the world believes precisely word for word the same thing. But in very broad terms, animism derives from the Latin word animus, meaning spirit, and is the idea that everything which is alive has a spirit. Every human being, every tree, every horse, every elephant, every cat and dog and octopus has spirit. Most animists, both those we know about in the ancient world where there is recordings and writings about them, and also most in the modern world, have a much broader definition of alive. And this is an interesting idea in itself. In this context, alive isn't just organic life forms. The neighbours are shouting at each other again. We're used to the idea of, obviously within modern science, Western science, organic means things like flesh and plant matter, which grow and rot and decay and so forth. Obviously, that's a very unscientific explanation, but you get the general point. Most people will accept that rosebush, well, everyone would accept that rose bushes are alive. You get a lot of argument if you talk about rose bushes having a mind and a consciousness, but people accept they're alive. The majority of people in the West would probably struggle with the idea that a rock is alive, or that a cloud is alive. For many animist cultures, and arguably the majority of the world is, or at least was at some point, animist, life isn't just organic life, it includes things like rocks and mountains and rivers and beaches and landscape features in general. So there is a much wider sense as to what is alive, what has animus, what has spirit. There's also a sort of practical follow-on to this, in that what has spirit leads somewhere. It's not just a sort of an airy-fairy statement. If a creature or a rock or whatever it may be has spirit, has animus, then there is an awareness there, is the assumption. It is aware of itself, it has needs, it has maybe likes and dislikes, if that's an appropriate way of talking about it. It's not to say that animists think that gerbils have exactly the same minds as humans. I've yet to meet an animist who thought that. It's not to say that animists believe that a rock has the same mental processes as a human being, or a dog, or a horse. Rather that each thing has its own type of mind, a rock type of mind, a tree type of mind, a sparrow type of mind. And that type of mind thinks about whatever it is that sort of creature thinks about. So the likes and hopes and dreams and fears and worries of a lion would be very, very different from those of a zebra, would be different again from those of a mountain. Well, obviously. It's a difficult concept because if you're talking about life, implicitly you must also talk about death. And obviously we know when a cat is alive or a cat is dead, and let's not even get into Schrödinger on this one. But if a mountain can be alive, therefore by implication we must consider the possibility that a mountain could also be dead at some point. And how would we as human beings be able to tell the difference between a living mountain and a dead one? That opens all sorts of weird, curious questions. But many, many, many ancient religions have their roots in animism. So a great many modern-day pagans will take the approach that not only is the oak tree at the end of their garden alive, in the sense that it's respirating and growing and so forth, but also it's alive in as much as it has a mind, it has thought processes, it has needs. And therefore, there's another implication coming, it can be communicated with, potentially. That it may be possible for a human to learn to communicate with something else that has soul. Majority of pet owners probably are more than willing to say that they communicate with their dogs and their cats and their horses and what have you. A great many farmers feel that they communicate with their sheep and goats and so forth. You can form personal relationships with a lot of domesticated animals and learn to read their emotions, their states of mind, know when they're hungry or they're tired or whatever. And they in exchange can often read ours. A great many dog and cat owners particularly will often be utterly convinced, I know I am, that their animals can read their cues and their emotions, and it's a two-way process. Obviously it gets difficult to argue you could conduct that sort of a process with a jellyfish. But, in principle at least, within animism it is potentially possible. The routes by which you would do that, through watching and observing and studying and living alongside, through meditation, through ritual, all sorts of techniques to try and communicate with other living beings. I'm leaving the realm of the dead to one side for a future podcast because a great many religions labelled as pagan involve belief in ancestral presences, that death is not the end, that people continue on into an afterlife and can still be contacted and communicated with. But that's perhaps better left to a separate discussion in the future. Briefly to mention the afterlife, as I'm trying to draw to a close because I'm aware I'm rambling on a bit here. You get different views. The Greeks, for example, believed that there was the fields of Elysium, this wonderful heavenly type of a place where the especially good went to live out their afterlife. But they also thought there were other parts in the afterlife, like Tartarus, where the terribly wicked were sent to expiate their wickedness and their cruelty. And there were sort of other regions that were really, quite frankly, rather dull, where the largely quite dull went to live out their afterlives. A lot of the heathen Germanic and Scandinavian tribes believed that where you went in the afterlife was at least partially dependent on how you died. So not how you lived, so much as how you died. So if you were a courageous warrior who died upon the fields of battle, you would go to Valhalla, the halls of the warriors. If you were a sailor and you fell off the boat and drowned at sea, you would go to the halls of Ran, the sea goddess, who took care of those who drowned. So depending on quite how you departed this realm would depend where you ended up. So there are different views as to the afterlife. Some ancient cultures went into a fair amount of detail. Others said comparatively little, and it's left to individual interpretation. A lot of modern-day pagans believe in reincarnation. Personally, I do. Some accept the idea that you will reincarnate into a species. Once a human, always a human. Others embrace the idea that the soul is not tied to one species, one gender, one anything. That it can come back as in different bodies, different animals. You might be a man this time, a woman next time. You might be black this time, Chinese next time, and Asian the time after. You might be a human this time, and a wolf or a bear or a parakeet next time round. So you can experience life in many different shapes and guises. Is there an ultimate goal to all of this? Different pagans have different views. I can tell you my view, but that's not necessarily representative of the vast majority of 21st century pagans. So from my personal perspective, I believe the soul goes through all of these different shapes and forms to enjoy and relish existence, rather than to seek redemption from existence. For me, it's the ideal of life is that it should be an excitement, a pleasure, a joy. Clearly, the reality for an enormous number of people is that life is full of suffering and misery and despair. But an awful lot of that suffering and misery and despair is inflicted by one lot of humans on another lot of humans. We can't blame the gods or anyone else for half of the suffering that happens, because it's entirely in the hands of our fellow humans. Therefore, part of the journey of life, the mission of life, if you like, is to try and make life as wonderful for other people as you can, to make other people's lives happy and content, or at least to do your best not to make them more miserable than they are, if nothing else. And not just other humans, but cats and dogs and horses and whatever other creatures you come across, to try and bring joy, so that we can all experience the wonder of existing and come back in lots of different shapes and see life from lots of different angles, to see it from the depths of the ocean, from flying through the air, from being a short-lived mayfly to being a 1,000-year-old yew tree. We can experience all sorts of wonderful and amazing things, and gradually our soul gets bigger and bigger and bigger in the process. But that, as I say, is just my belief, and I can't testify as to how widespread that sort of belief would be amongst other pagans, because I've encountered different beliefs with other pagans out there. We have festivals during the course of the year, but that depends on the type of pagan. So Wiccans celebrate one set, heathens another set, the Hellenismos, the Greek pagans, different set again. Some of those festivals are tied into the tides of nature, celebrating the start of summer or spring or winter. Some are tied into agricultural cycles, so the harvests of particular crops or important points in the life of livestock, sometimes in the lives of wild animals. So one of my favourite festivals, the Lupercalia from ancient Rome, celebrates the mating season of wolves, which, for the European wolf at any rate, is kicking off around about mid-February, when that festival of Lupercalia starts. So there's all sorts of different festivals out there, and a lot are nature-based. Some do celebrate things other than nature. So the ancient Romans had a day on which they celebrated the foundation of ancient Rome, for example, a political event rather than an event in the natural order of things. So there are mixed festivals. Some pagans stick to one particular culture. Other pagans will go on practically a ritual crawl and go to anything they can find to go to that has meaning and import to them. And that is a particular feature of a pluralist religion like the ones we're looking into, is that whereas if you are perhaps, let's say, a Catholic, you wouldn't necessarily want to go and attend a Muslim festival. You'd be, well, maybe out of interfaith curiosity, but not out of personal conviction. Whereas as a pagan, as I follow a Druid path, there is absolutely nothing to prevent me joining in, if I'm invited, with a Wiccan ritual or a heathen ritual or a Kemetic ritual. Indeed, I've done so on many occasions. So we can kind of go to each other's festivities and be open to the idea that my gods exist and your gods exist and everyone's gods exist. So we can be open to a multitude of worship in that way. In a future podcast, we'll think about things like ethics and moral standards and so on that are found within paganism, as well as the role of the dead and various other important issues. But this is more of a trial run to see if anyone wants there to be another podcast in this line. I'm going to get back to making my rhubarb crumble. Hopefully you'll have found this interesting. If you do, let me know and I'll put some more out. If you think it's completely useless, keep your opinions to yourself and I won't. Thank you. Bye-bye.